Lake Elizabeth in California has always been a haven for those seeking tranquility. Situated in a small town surrounded by mountains, the lake offered unparalleled natural beauty, crystal clear waters reflecting the blue sky, and an untouched landscape that looked like something out of a postcard. But behind this serenity, there was a darkness that few dared to mention. It was the legend of the monster of Lake Elizabeth, a creature that, according to the town's oldest residents, was older than the town itself, a being that lived in the lake's depths, and that no one should ever disturb. Jake had heard the story since childhood. His grandmother, a woman full of superstitions, always told him never to swim alone in the lake, especially at dusk. "There are things in that lake you don't understand," she would say, with eyes full of a wisdom that Jake, at the time, thought was exaggerated. Things that live in the water and should not be disturbed. But like many children, he grew up and distanced himself from those stories, treating them as mere legends that the elderly told to scare the young. Now, at 30, Jake had returned to the town after years of living in the hustle and bustle of Los Angeles. He was seeking peace, a fresh start away from the chaos of the big city. He decided to settle in a cabin near the lake, where he had spent many summers of his childhood. It was the perfect place to write the book he had always wanted, surrounded by nature and the quiet he longed for. The first few weeks were peaceful. Jake spent his days walking the trails around the lake, exploring the old spots of his childhood, and reconnecting with memories long forgotten. But as the nights grew longer and the fog began to creep over the lake at dusk, he started to notice something different. It all began with a feeling, a chill running down his spine whenever he approached the water at dusk. It was as if he was being watched. Jake ignored it at first, attributing it to the cold wind or his own imagination. But the feeling persisted, a presence that seemed to hide beneath the lake's calm surface, waiting, watching. One night, while writing in his cabin, Jake heard a strange sound coming from the lake. It was a low, guttural noise, something he couldn't identify. He stopped typing, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, and listened intently. The sound continued, a long, distant moan that seemed to come from the depths. He glanced at the clock. It was almost 11 at night. Feeling intrigued, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped out of the cabin, following the sound to the lake shore. The air was cold, and a thick fog covered the lake's surface, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Jake walked slowly toward the water, where the sound was strongest. It was like the sound of something large moving beneath the water, but he couldn't see anything. His heart beat faster, a mixture of curiosity and fear growing inside him. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. The lake was eerily silent, except for the gentle lapping of waves on the shore. Jake waited, holding the flashlight tightly, trying to see through the fog. That's when he saw it. A huge shadow passing just beneath the surface, moving with frightening speed. The water rippled, and Jake instinctively stepped back, fear gripping him. He knew he should go back to the cabin, but his feet seemed rooted to the ground. The curiosity that had always driven him now kept him there, even as his instincts screamed to flee. Then the water churned violently, and something emerged. For a moment, Jake saw only a blur, a dark, scaly mass that reflected the faint light, with large, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. What he saw lasted only a few seconds, but they felt like an eternity. The creature stared at him, its presence so overwhelming that Jake could barely breathe. Then, with a swift and fluid movement, the creature disappeared into the depths, leaving the water calm and the air silent once more. Jake ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind him, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He tried to process what he had just seen, but it was as if his mind refused to believe it. It was impossible, surreal, and yet he knew it was real. There was something in the lake, something that shouldn't exist but was there, alive and aware. The next morning, Jake tried to ignore what had happened. He went about his routine, walking the trails and trying to focus on his writing. But the thought of the creature wouldn't leave him. He avoided going near the lake, but the feeling of being watched persisted, and he knew he couldn't keep pretending nothing had happened. Determined to understand what he had seen, Jake began researching the lake's history. He visited the town's small library, talked to the older residents, and read everything he could find about the area. That's how he discovered the ancient Native American legends about the lake. According to the stories, Lake Elizabeth was considered a sacred place, inhabited by ancient spirits that protected the land. There were also reports of sightings of a monstrous creature, described as having scaly skin and glowing eyes, living in the lake's depths and appearing only to those who disturbed the natural balance of the place. Jake realized that the legend of the lake monster wasn't just a story to scare children. There was a kernel of truth in it, something he had witnessed with his own eyes. And the more he researched, the clearer it became that the lake was a place of ancient power, where the normal rules of nature didn't apply. One afternoon, while at the library, Jake met a man named Samuel, an old town resident known as one of the few who spoke openly about the lake. Samuel was an elderly man with clear, piercing eyes that seemed to see beyond the visible world. When Jake mentioned the lake, Samuel simply nodded, as if he had been expecting this conversation. "I know what you saw," said Samuel, his voice deep and calm. "Most people prefer to pretend it doesn't exist, but make no mistake, what you saw is real. That lake is ancient, older than any of us can imagine. And what lives down there? It's not something you want to provoke." Jake listened intently as Samuel told stories passed down through generations. Stories of fishermen who vanished without a trace, of residents who swore they saw something lurking by the shores at night. Samuel spoke of a portal at the bottom of the lake, a passage to a place no human should ever explore. "It's like the lake is a veil," Samuel said. "A veil between this world and something much darker." Samuel's words echoed in Jake's mind as he walked back to the cabin that night. He knew there was something in the lake, something that shouldn't be disturbed. But at the same time, he felt an irresistible pull, a need to uncover the truth behind the legends. That night, he couldn't sleep. The sound of the lake seemed louder than ever, as if it was calling to him. Jake knew he needed to face the creature again, to understand what was really happening. So, just before dawn, he grabbed his flashlight and walked to the lake's shore, where the fog still covered the water like a shroud. He stood there watching the lake in silence, waiting. And then, as if responding to his call, the water began to stir. The creature emerged again, its glowing eyes fixed on Jake. But this time, he didn't back away. Instead, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if he was finally accepting the creature's presence. Jake stepped closer to the water, feeling the creature's presence all around him. He knew the lake held secrets that would never be fully understood, but now he was at peace with it. He knew there was a connection between him and the lake, something that went beyond human understanding. And so, Jake remained there, on the edge of Lake Elizabeth, as the sun began to rise over the mountains. He knew his life would never be the same, but he also knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. And you? Would you have the courage to face the unknown? Would you keep investigating, even knowing there are things in the world that might be beyond our understanding? If this story has piqued your curiosity, don't miss out on the other mysteries we have to share. The lake may have revealed only a small part of its secrets, but there is much more to discover.